We started the last year. Hopefully, we don't have to say more technical difficulties. Everything I guess is something
We stopped it before we restarted. It's getting worse. Was she bringing?
Oh, this is her computer.
Yes.
I guess this must be her core.
Yes. Yeah.
That's some good Velcro. Oh yeah. He did something before. I don't know what he did.
Well, he restarted. Unplugged it, restarted it.
Okay.
So I think that's what he's going to do again.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
She got to get on YouTube. One of them is statement.
Yeah, Sunday it was like.
sorry. Can you look at the?
Well, I can't see it.
Okay. Good. Then you won't be checking out. But if you can monitor the stuff. Yeah. I think I did.
Oh,
Yeah.
I thought you had.
Oh, yeah. No. I just didn't get it back to you before. Chuck went and got us both something to eat, so I was in here by myself, and I could. I think I'm good.
It's all right. Good heavens. How about that? Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good.
I haven't seen you in a while.
I know, not since you nearly cut your arm off.
Are you still hiking?
Yeah, we hiked today.
I am. I told Jim not long ago, this project is about to wind down, and I'm gonna hike with him again, which I hope means with you as well.
Yes, we've had some interesting hikes. But on what? Thursday. Well, yeah, but Tuesday. Oh, yeah. It's been a long day.
A short meander.
So you walked through it? Yes, but we went to the Spence cabin in Elkmont. Have you not ever been there? Oh, you and I have to walk around there.
How far is it?
Well, you can stop at any place. There's lots of old remains of the cabins that were built back in the 40s and 50s, and it's Daisy Town. They've restored all the houses that were used by people who lived there in the summer. Yeah. So,
Okay.
are there reserved seats somewhere?
The front row looks good.
Bob Street.
Maybe like.
Let's start right on the dot at 7.
Is it 7?
Not yet.
Oh.
6:58. Oh.
So, you think just shut it down, gets rid of it, unplugged it, restarted it. Well, that's true. Well, I would let you see it, but I know you will lose it, so.
Welcome to all of you that are here at the Williams Family Library in Seymour. And welcome to those who are watching this program at home. And we will also be, it's being filmed, so it'll be available on the Facebook, the Friends of Seymour Library Facebook page, if you want to share that with anyone. I also would like to tell you that of the 600 books that we have printed, we have less than 70 remaining. So if you were planning to buy some for Christmas giving, be a good idea to do it tonight. We are reprinting, but it'll be several weeks before we get those. So I just want to give all of you who are attending this program virtually and in person a heads up about that. Okay, a little warning. Anna and I are not Civil War historians. What we are is storytellers, telling the stories of the people we interviewed in the Boyds Creek Valley and stories we learned from the research we did. So this is a somewhat informal presentation. We hope you will enjoy it and make you want to read the entire book if you haven't already gotten it. So, the seeds were sown for the tragic insurrection that was the Civil War back in the 15th century, when the Pope issued several bulls which collectively were the doctrine of discovery. It gave license to the major powers of the world to launch explorations into the kingdoms of the indigenous peoples in Africa and in North America. That mindset carried over to North America with the arrival in 1619 of the first 20 and odd Africans. The stage was set for the Civil War long before the first state, South Carolina, seceded or the bombs burst over Fort Sumter. Churches in the South sounded the bellwether for the dissolution of the Union. Congregations in the Boyds Creek Valley had enjoyed mixed assemblies of people, black and white, in their worship. Some of the people of African descent attended worship with the people who held them in bondage. Others were free blacks. Among those attending worship at the Boyds Creek Baptist, at Trundle's Crossroad Methodist, and Eusebia Presbyterian, joined in the worship. They heard from the pulpit the preacher say, "Slaves, obey your master." But they also had the opportunity to talk together outside the church and share information. It has been reported that only 10% of the population of this young country were churchgoers. We tend to think, oh, they were all crowding into churches on Sunday morning. Seeking to evangelize more of the population, 2 Presbyterian pastors went to Kentucky and held what were the first camp meetings. Soon they were joined by the Baptists and the Methodists, and this was what we call the Great Awakening. It awakened an evangelical fervor in the people, and the churches grew. But something else came from the Great Awakening, and that was a greater emphasis on abolition. As Northern abolitionists and groups like the Quakers began calling for the emancipation of those in bondage, dissension arose in congregations over the issue. The Baptists were the first to disassociate from their Northern brethren forming the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845 to protect what they called the peculiar institution, or slavery. The Methodists were not far behind, and the Trundles Crossroads Church became the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Although Presbyterians had been arguing about this for many years, it was not until the Presbyterian General Assembly issued a call saying every congregation needed to support the federal government. And that was the last straw. And the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America was formed in 1861. I put the triggers up there, and you probably read those while I was speaking. But like the Methodist Bishop Andrew, Jerry Wade of Trundles Crossroads held enslaved people who had been inherited by his wife Margaret from her father, Daniel L. Trundle. As with many others, he was conflicted about slavery. Wade said in his later years, "I knew that slavery was not right." To avoid being conscripted by the Confederate Army, Wade slipped off in the night and went to Kentucky to join the Union Army. When slave traders were roaming the countryside, his wife, Margaret, replied to the enslaved people in her home who were begging her not to sell them. She said, "I will never sell you." I'm sure she was very relieved when emancipation came and she could tell them they could choose whether to work for her or not. Alan?
I'd like to talk a little bit about Boyds Creek in the 1850s, before the Civil War started. It was a prosperous community. Farming was going well, and there were two plantations, the Woodlands Plantation and Ferguson Ferry Plantation. They were booming, and new houses were being built. Some of those houses are still around today. One of them is Glenvilla, the B.D. Babson's house, and his brother Thomas also built his house in the 1850s. That's now called the Sidecar Inn. You may have seen it. And Adam Harvey Keener built his house at Trundles Crossroads. That's the big brick house at the side of Boyds Creek Road. And there were other houses built there. It was a prosperous community, but nevertheless there was tension there, as Collins expressed. Slavery was not the only issue. There were not many slaves locally compared to some of the big plantations out in West Tennessee and other parts of the Southeast. Even slaveholders were for staying in the Union. There was a strong tradition in East Tennessee of how ancestors had shed their blood during the Revolution to create a nation that was unified America. For example, a lot of the people who helped found the Boyds Creek area had fought at Kings Mountain. And those stories were handed down from generations, only a couple of generations actually. So there's still that pride in a perfect union, if you like. However, John Chandler, who was the owner of Weaklings, he saw what was coming. He understood the unease. He had Confederate leanings. But in 1859, he decided to hedge his bets, and he married Anne Wayland Irwin. She grew up just down the road at the Wayland home. There were strong Union connections in her family, so they balanced each other out. They were both middle-aged, they were both widowed, they both had grown children, but this was not a marriage of love, but of convenience, and it came with a signed contract. It was a kind of prenup. And you'll learn more about that later. In 1861, the way that you made your influence felt was not through Facebook or TV or email or anything like that. The way you influenced or entertained people was giving a speech. And there was a lot of speechifying in 1861. In February, Oliver Perry Temple, who was a Knoxville lawyer and a slaveholder, who was passionately pro-union, he gave a speech outside Rocky Springs Academy. That is a private school that no longer exists, no trace of it left. It was close to the Wayland home. And Wayland Chandler's brothers had built the school, but it wasn't large enough to hold the crowd that turned up on that cold, chilly February morning. 1,000 people turned up. And when you think that the population of Boyds Creek was probably a lot less than 1,000 at that time, that's kind of amazing. Temple said, in a book that he wrote later, that the crowd assembled on Academy Hill, which is the area behind where this academy was, listened to him for 2 hours on a raw, chilly day. So anyway, 3 days later, it was time for a vote on whether local voters or East Tennessee voters wanted to hold a convention to discuss seceding from the Union. Only one person in the whole of Sevier County, and he was not from Boyds Creek, voted to hold that secession convention. They didn't even want to talk about it. However, I'm afraid they were outnumbered because when Fort Sumter was attacked and war was declared on April the 12th, shortly after that, President Lincoln called for 75,000 troops to invade the South. But that changed a few minds locally because people really did not want to see Northerners invading their homeland. But not enough. This was still a very strongly Union area. But Middle and East and West Tennessee were all for secession, and East Tennessee was outvoted. So Tennessee seceded from the Union, and a trickle of men like J.J. Wade headed to Kentucky to join the Union Army. And others, there were 2 sons of Jonathan Johnson, joined the Home Guard, which was a Union kind of on-the-spot type of local militia, if you like. They were captured by Confederate forces. One of the brothers escaped. The other, James Cooley Johnson, persuaded his captors to let him go home to change his shirt. And once he got home, he slipped out the back window and headed for the hills. Went up north to join the army. And now I'll pass it back to Colleen.
We're going to take a little road trip to the eastern coast of Virginia, and it'll become clear later why this relates to Boyds Creek. Fort Monroe is situated near Point Comfort, where the first enslaved Africans were brought in 1619. While that arrival signaled centuries of pain and suffering for the Africans, Fort Monroe provided a beacon of freedom for some. This is a story of a daring escape by 3 enslaved men who were owned by a Confederate colonel in Virginia. He had forced these men to make armaments for the Confederate forces, and they were going to be sent to North Carolina to shore up the defenses for the Confederates. They recognized that that was not something they wanted to do, and they were willing to risk rowing across Norfolk Harbor to Fort Monroe. They knew they could be shot. They did not know what kind of welcome they would get. But they were asking for sanctuary. Now, General Benjamin Butler was aware of the decree not to harbor escaped slaves. Upon reflection, however, he thought he had found a loophole in that law, the fugitive slave law. Throughout history, those goods that were confiscated from an enemy in the war were called contraband. Recognizing the Confederacy's own twisted thinking that the persons they enslaved were property, and that property was being used against the federal government, Butler made the decision to confiscate illegal property. In other words, he welcomed those 3 men. They were considered contraband of war, and the Grand Contraband Camp, the first in the nation, grew up quickly around Fort Monroe, followed by many others wherever the Union forces gained control. Congress registered its approval of Butler's policy when it passed the first Confiscation Act. This law stated that if slaves are, in fact, property, and if this property is owned by any person in active rebellion against the lawful federal authority, then the U.S. military has every right to deny its use and take it to itself. Any slave that could be wrested from the Confederacy would therefore be, in a technical sense, the property of the United States government. Now, history has not recorded the names of the men and women in the Boyds Creek Valley who seized the prospect of freedom for themselves and their children by fleeing either to the Quakers in Blount County or to the Union strongholds in Knoxville. The Union Army tried to ignore the masses of Black runaways seeking protective shelter within its ranks, but once it was encouraged by the federal authorities, it moved slowly to accommodate them. Contraband camps sprang up around all of the major cities in Tennessee, including our own Knoxville, toward which many of the enslaved people emancipated themselves and went to. Anna?
Well, that was the state of affairs in 1861. And along that time, the Confederates had been fairly lenient with the Unions. They were hoping that if they did not push them too hard, that the Unionists would decide to join up with the Confederates. But in November, something happened that changed all that. East Tennessee, someone in East Tennessee hatched a plan to destroy 9 railway bridges, 8 of them in East Tennessee and 1 in northern Alabama, to prevent Confederate supplies and troops from reaching the South. If you destroy the bridge, the railway can't run. Immediately afterwards, the plan was that General Sherman and his army would invade East Tennessee. This was when the Union folks were going to sweep in, and Lincoln himself approved the plan. The person who was put in charge of the attack on the Strawberry Plains Railroad Bridge over the Holston River was William Cowan Pickens, a local man. He was a former Sevier County sheriff and the son of Judge Samuel Pickens, who was a respected landowner in the DuPont area and a state rep and a judge. And William was allowed to pick his own men to help him, and he chose, according to Opie Temple, he chose 9 Sevier County men to accompany him. And Temple called Pickens, quote, a bold, dashing, reckless, good-natured fellow who delighted in just such adventures as this. He was out to have some fun. At the last minute, however, the plan went wrong because General Sherman decided he didn't have the troops to invade Tennessee, East Tennessee. However, again, there's no internet, there's no Facebook, there's no way to tell the proposed bridge builders that the deal is off. So they all go ahead, all 9 of those bridges. This is what happened at one bridge, not the street, not the Holston Bridge that we are talking about. Anyway, on the night of November the 8th, Pickens and his men rode to Straw Plains. And he and most of his men climbed from the riverbank to the railroad, leaving a couple to look after the horses. And Pickens struck a match to light a pine torch and burn the bridge. A shot rings out. There's one guard, James Keeling, a railway guard, who fires, and he hits Pickens in the leg, so Pickens is wounded. The rest of the conspirators attack Keeling, and in the fight, one of them accidentally stabs poor Pickens, so now he's got 2 wounds. Keeling, however, is very badly wounded, and he manages to get away, I think by rolling down the riverbank, rolling down the bank, I don't know. Anyway, so here are the conspirators on the bridge. The bridge is theirs for the burning, but Pickens has dropped his matches in the kerfuffle. Where are his matches? They're not on the ground. You can't find them down below. No matches, no pine torch to light. The deal is off. So that's what happens there. They talk about maybe going over to a nearby house and innocently asking, do you have a light? Might be in the middle of the night. No, they decide that's probably not a good idea. So they go home. Now Pickens is wounded. However, Keeling the next day becomes a Confederate hero. He was a brave man, there's no doubt about it. His hand was so badly damaged it had to be amputated. And the stories got wilder and wilder about how many men he fought off 40 men single-handedly at the bridge, etc. But then there's also been a story that the Union put out a story that Keeling was dead, which he wasn't. So, the railroad gave Keeling a pension for life, which proved that they thought he was a hero too. During the Civil War, that bridge was built and destroyed 4 times. And that's a picture taken in 1864, the year, a couple of years after this happened. 4 of the 9 bridges that had been targeted were attacked, were destroyed, but others weren't. The conspirators returned to Boyds Creek on horseback, with Pickens riding on somebody else's horse. He was so badly injured he couldn't do that for himself. Probably via the Underdown Ferry. The Underdown Ferry was at the end of McCleary Road. And White Underdown was part owner of that ferry, which made it very convenient. He was one of the conspirators. And the ferries did not run at night, so it was a clear shot back to Boyds Creek. And they took Pickens to the Keener House at Tremble's Crossroads, where probably Dr. John Cumberland Ellis, who lived very close to the Keener House, looked after his wounds, patched them up. The next day, 400 or so Union supporters had heard the rumor that the Union Army was coming, so they decided to head for Straw Plains, going through Boyds Creek, expecting to see the Union Army, and instead, when they got as far as the Underdown Ferry, on the other side of the ferry stood some Confederate supporters, and there was no army, obviously. So they skirmished for about 36 hours. I guess they shot at each other across the river and insulted each other pretty much. And then it became obvious that the Union Army was not coming. They went home. Meanwhile, Pickens was moved from house to house to keep him safe because the Confederates were after him, obviously. And then O.P. Temple says he was placed on a shed, concealed with corn fodder, and hauled back to the mountains. And West Valley folks kept him and his co-conspirators safe and supplied with food and other necessities that winter. Then Pickens, as soon as he was able, with the other conspirators, and also with his brother Samuel, went up to Kentucky and joined the Union Army. And this is a picture of Samuel's oath of allegiance. Here, all the men had to sign to say that they would be true to the Union. The Confederates saw red at this point. They declared martial law. They brought thousands more troops into East Tennessee. They hung 5 of the burners of the other bridges. They arrested anyone with Union leanings. That included William Pickens's father, Judge Samuel Pickens, who was in his 50s, I think, at that time. He was sent to Tuscaloosa prison in Alabama. It was so overcrowded that he weakened, and a few weeks later he died in prison. Edmund Hodges at Boyds Creek, who was the father of 19 children, also died in a prison several months later. And even the Bramson son-in-law, Dr. Robert Hodgson of Rose Glen, over by Sevierville, which was the county's biggest plantation at that time, he was briefly in prison, but he had a little political clout and didn't have to stay in there long. And at this point, the trickle of men heading north turns into a flood. This leaves the women and the children to look after the farms, and life got very hard. And here are some of the things that happened during this period. Mary Narcissa Keener had to hide with 2 small children in the cellar of her house under the kitchen while soldiers ransacked her house upstairs. That must have been really scary. There's just one way out of that cellar, and it was up through the kitchen floor. She wasn't going to do that. At the Wayland house, there's a story that you may have heard, because lots of people have heard this story. The story is that one Union soldier, maybe 2 soldiers, rode their horses up the stairs to hide from Confederate forces. Now, if you've ever been in there, and I hope you haven't because the place is falling down, you can see it's almost impossible, I think, to actually ride a horse up there. They have led a horse up the staircase to escape the pursuers. And then the story says that some of that maybe the men were caught and killed, but probably they weren't. We don't know. It's just a kind of family story. There is, however, definitely a bullet hole at the Thomas Branson house, which was the result of some drunken Civil War shenanigans. And there's another one that's on the outside of it. It's not actually in the baluster, it's inside the house, it's outside the house, above the door. And at Wheatlands, there is a baby. She is the grandchild of John Chandler, the son of Timothy Chandler, John's son. She's a small baby, and she's lying in her bed when a few seconds later, someone throws a rock through the window of the house, just as Anna Wayland Chandler manages to pick her up. A few seconds later, if she'd still been lying there, it might just have killed her. Anyway, that's the cell. She was just a baby at that point. However, there were kindnesses during this period. And this story involves General Longstreet, the Confederate general. He brought his men, they were camping out in the whites community. And Longstreet told Jane Jenkins, whose husband was away at war, that she was supposed to make him breakfast every morning. And she did that for quite a while. And finally, one morning, she tells Longstreet that his men have now taken her last horse, a bay mare. Now, in those days, a farm without a horse was like a modern farm with no tractor or no pickup. There was no way to do anything in the fields, no way to get anything to market without a horse. So anyway, Longstreet realizes this is really bad for her. He takes two of her children, puts them in front of him on his horse, and rides to his encampment, orders his men to parade all the bay mares in front of him. They do that, the children recognizes the horse, and they put the children back on the horse and they rode safely home. So there were kindnesses in the war. And now I'm going to pass it back to Colleen.
President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation went into effect January 1st, 1863, for those who were enslaved in states that were still in rebellion against the United States. In a deal made with Andrew Johnson, however, this did not include Tennessee because it was then under Union control. President Lincoln leaned on Andrew Johnson, who had his own personal slaves. He said, that does not look good for you. You're the military governor of Tennessee. I want you to free your enslaved people. And so on August 8th, 1863, Andrew Johnson freed his enslaved people, some of whom were his illegitimate children. This is why today we celebrate the 8th of August as Emancipation Day, and not only in Tennessee, but in surrounding states, they have adopted that. It was not until February 22nd, 1865, through a constitutional amendment, that all slaves were freed in the state of Tennessee. Now I want to tell you one of my very favorite stories that I discovered in the research for this book. You've been hearing about White Underdown and Underdown Ferry. Keep that in mind. A man named James was born on the Rabson Ferry plantation, the son of an unnamed enslaved mother and a white father named Stephen Underdown. Of course, children born to enslaved mothers assumed the status of their mother, no matter who fathered them. In the disposition of enslaved people at Rabson Ferry Plantation, James was given to Lucy Dodson Rabson, who married William Carr Scruggs of Greene County. James was living with the Scruggs, and he apparently escaped from them in 1863 and joined up with the Union's 2nd Tennessee Infantry. And it just happened that Joseph Underdown was a lieutenant and White Underdown was a member of that force. So he joined the White Infantry as a black man, and records say James, colored man, enlisting the enlisted men for the infantry. He was with his brothers when Confederate forces routed the Union forces that were holding Rogersville in Hawkins County. They took 409, the Confederates took 494 prisoners that day. This was such a big deal. It was written up in the New York Times and other big city papers. Well, White Underdown escaped from his captors. And apparently he bought a horse from a local farmer, and he wanted his brother, James Underdown, to take it home to his farm in Boyds Creek. Well, on the way, federal forces encountered James. They needed that horse, and so they took it, and James made his way on to Boyds Creek with no horse. The reason we know so much about this is that White Underdown filed a claim after the war with the United States Claim Commission, and he asked James, his half-brother, to testify on his behalf. As a result, we have a detailed description of the enslavement, the self-emancipation, and his exploits with the white infantry. Very rare to have anything like that for blacks of that time.
Now we're going to go to Knoxville. In the fall of 1863, the Confederates moved out of Knoxville. Most of the activity at that point was down in the Chattanooga area. And the Union troops arrived, and they were led by General Ambrose Burnside. And if you've ever wondered where the word sideburns come from, but actually what I found out was that the word sideburns was actually some Burnsides to start with, and then somehow it got switched. But he's just such a great example. Anyway, he led the Union troops, and people from Boyds Creek and elsewhere in Sevier County rushed to Knoxville to give him a rapturous welcome. He was greeted by conquering era. However, Longstreet had not yet given up all thoughts of leaving the area, and he began to besiege the city. And here we have a map of Knoxville. However, Longstreet has got a problem. His Port Standards, which is heavily fortified. This is the Holston River. Nowadays we call it the Tennessee River, all right, that part. At that point, that top part of the Tennessee River was called the Holston. And Longstreet had a faulty map which showed that the French Broad came into the Holston here, below Knoxville, whereas in fact it actually comes in above Knoxville, the other side, over towards Colleen. And this meant that Longstreet was not interested in particularly what happened on the other side. He didn't send out his spies to look or anything like that. He was convinced that the French Broad was not going to be able to supply Knoxville, but it was. And that meant that the people of Boyds Creek and elsewhere upriver could load boats and send them down the Holston, now the Tennessee, at night to help feed the troops and feed the people in Knoxville. Now they did that to the best of their ability, but the troops were still only on half rations, right? So even though Boyds Creek did what it could, things are getting pretty tough for the people in Fort Simmons and in Knoxville for that matter. So anyway, finally, Longstreet loses patience and decides to attack. And he's made another mistake, because he doesn't realize how deep the trenches are around, and the ditches are around the fortified Fort Sanders. His men rush into the battle. They realize that they're caught in these deep ditches. There's an 8-foot wall to the top, and they just can't handle it. They can't do it. Meanwhile, the Union troops who are up on the ramparts of Fort Sanders just fire down on them, and it's a slaughter. And the battle is over in about half an hour. There are dreadful losses on the Confederate side, and the Union has won. And Longstreet gives up the siege a couple of days later. And at this point, I'm going to hand it back to Colleen.
After General Burnside took control of Knoxville in 1863, men who had escaped their enslavers found work with the Union Army as laborers. The most urgent work for contraband men around Knoxville was the fortification of the city against the rebel attack. Using contraband workers freed up soldiers for other military duties. Captain Orlando Poe, who's the Army engineer who designed the military fortifications, had high praise for the 200 African Americans who worked on the project. He said, "They are tractable and willing. They did an amount of work that was truly astonishing. Day and night they worked without a murmur. For the first week, they regularly labored 18 hours out of the 24, and they would continue to do so during the duration of the war." Now, Steve, let's take a look back at slide 21. This is the map you all were looking at before. There's been a lot of speculation about where the contraband camps were located. There's not a whole lot of good research, but I was fortunate to stumble on a letter that gave us some insight into this. Most people say that they were on the south side of the river where the military gardens were. That would make sense because the gardeners were mostly the formerly enslaved men, and they would be near their wives in the contraband camp. Others say that it's up here where the present Knoxville College is, because that was where the Confederate conscript camp was, and it was near the railroads. Others say there were so many contraband in Knoxville, it was here and it was here. And if Knoxville, and we know it was like the other big cities in Tennessee, the contraband camps evolved out into the African American neighborhoods that followed the war. Although food was scarce, sanitary conditions horrendous, disease rampant, and housing pitiful, the life was slightly better for the East Tennessee contrabands than it had been in slavery. They had a degree of freedom they had never known before. They could legally marry, they could worship, they could get schooling. Although the Army paid men for their labor, others had to come up with ways to earn some money. And if they were a blacksmith or a seamstress during slavery, then that was something that they could do to earn money. And lots of them became gardeners. The U.S. Sanitary Commission, financed by the federal government, and the U.S. Charitable Commission, supported by northern churches, sent medicines, food, clothes, and shoes. These supplies went first to the beleaguered citizens of Knoxville, next to the white refugees that sought safety in Knoxville, and finally to the descendants of Africans who were there. But they were glad to get whatever they could. The shoes were especially prized because few enslaved people had shoes. In fact, some slave owners locked up all the shoes at night to prevent their enslaved people from escaping. So shoes became a symbol for a new kind of freedom. With the continued influx of contrabands, these camps began to function as little villages, and it subsequently became the neighborhoods in Knoxville. Early in the Civil War, President Lincoln had opposed accepting Black soldiers into military service. In the North, however, there were Black militias trained and able and ready to go to war. The Emancipation Proclamation opened the door for Southern Blacks to enlist in the Union Army. Formerly enslaved men who escaped to Kentucky were able to join colored regiments forming around Camp Nelson there. On May 22nd, 1863, the War Department authorized the establishment of the Bureau of Colored Troops. The military was segregated by regiments, but Black and white regiments often went into battle together, but all commissioned officers in the Black regiments were white. Black soldiers received lower pay and were often relegated to tasks that white soldiers refused to do. They suffered racist taunts and ridicule from fellow white soldiers, but were often commended for their bravery and perseverance by the white officers commanding their units. Blacks serving with the Union faced far greater dangers than the average white soldiers. Confederate President Jefferson Davis threatened that Black prisoners would be enslaved or executed. Their white officers would receive severe punishment for, quote, inciting servile insurrection. Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest acted on this threat at Fort Pillow in West Tennessee. After the Union forces, both Black and white, had surrendered, Confederate General Chalmers was recorded as saying, quote, the Blacks and their officers were shot down, bayoneted, and put to the sword in cold blood. The massacre gave rise to the rallying cry, remember Fort Pillow, for Black troops during the remainder of the war. This slide shows the display for the United States Colored Troops at the Beck Cultural Exchange Center in Knoxville, which is the repository for Black history for all of East Tennessee. And you will also see in there a listing of some of the formerly enslaved Boyds Creek men who joined the United States Colored Troops. And we find James Underdown again. So he's been with the white infantry, and now he's going to be with the U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery. James and most of the others enlisted in Knoxville in the spring of '64 for 3 years with the 1st Colored Heavy Artillery that mustered out March 66 in 1866. They helped to defend Knoxville and took part in battles throughout East Tennessee and North Carolina. Disease, including smallpox, typhoid, and persistent diarrhea, caused more debilitation and deaths than battle. Going absent without leave was a common occurrence. Claiborne Chandler, who was known as Clay, had been promoted to corporal before he went AWOL. He did that because he needed to care for his family. He was afraid they didn't have anything to eat. He was demoted and sent to military prison. Noting how often this happened, Lieutenant Colonel James A. Shannon, not related to me, wanted information with regard to providing for the families of those men who had been enlisted. He said, some 50 families are now here and no adequate provision has either been made or authorized for them. Shannon was referring to those contraband villages south of the Holston River. He recommended employing the women in the village as cooks and laundresses at the hospital for a regulated wage so that the families could be provided for and the soldiers would not have to desert. Clay Chandler was pardoned and again promoted to corporal after his release from prison. He really must have appreciated Shannon's kindness because he named his first son Shannon. The 1880 census records show that 10-year-old Shannon and his 12-year-old sister Rebecca were working in the home of Timothy Chandler.
Meanwhile, East Tennessee was in probably the worst shape that it ever was. There were two armies now, because Longstreet has not gone away, and he is not being pursued, so there are two armies roaming the countryside, taking everything they can to survive. They were foraging, and that's a polite way of saying stealing, taking, appropriating, doing whatever was necessary for food. They were skirmishing. It was a bitterly, bitterly cold winter, the worst of the war. And here I was going to read an excerpt from a book. I don't have my book, so I'll read that out. Anyway, it was an article from Chattanooga paper saying things were so terrible that they had no idea how anybody in East Tennessee could survive till the next winter. There were families leaving, women and children in particular, leaving the farms and going to Knoxville because they just couldn't find any way to make it otherwise. There were really, here's some Confederate money, which of course was pretty useless. At one point, it was reported that money was a little bit more easy to come by these days, but there was nothing to spend it on. So what difference did it make? And of course, Confederate money had lost all its value by the end of the war. It gradually dropped during the war. Anyway, more Confederate men left the area now that Knoxville had gone to the Union Army. John Chandler, his son Timothy, left Wheatlands, and that left Anne Wayland Chandler in charge of Wheatlands. And this is what John and Anne have talked about in their prenup agreement, their contract when they got married. That Anne, of course, had Union connections. The Union is largely in charge, and even though it's a Confederate house and the Union people are going to use it, she's still able to kind of soften round the corners a little bit for it. She did a very good job of keeping charge of Wheatlands anyway. It became a headquarters for some Northern troops, and it was also a field hospital. The officers would go out, forage, and find food, or the men would go out, forage, find food, and the Chandler enslaved people would cook it. And then, as the officers ate it, Miss Dell, the little granddaughter, who is now 3 or 4 years old, charmed the officers sat on their knees at lunchtime, at mealtimes. And this is a picture of Miss Dell much later in life, but you can see how cute she must have been as a 3 or 4 year old. There's another story of one of the Johnson brothers. Robert Boyd Johnson was in the Union Army when he heard that his farm was the site of a Union encampment, and that because of that, his livestock were being slaughtered, and there was generally a mess being made at his farm. And he's very perturbed about this, so he deserts. He deserts his army unit, He comes back to Boyds Creek and he manages to sort things out. It turns out that the Union encampment thought they were on Confederate land when they weren't. Anyway, he returns to his unit and is not reprimanded. They're just so glad that he came back that he's not punished at all. And another happy result of his trip home was that his wife had a baby 9 months later. There was only one Civil War battle in Sevier County during this time, per se. That was the Battle of Fairgarden in early 1864. It was a running cavalry battle down the New Centre Road, all the way down to Rose Glen, Big Plantation, which is now where Walter State Community College is, outside Seville. But it belonged at that time to Dr. Robert Hodgson, the son-in-law of the Bradson family. He lay sick in bed while this battle was raging on his property, and he was to die a few months later, actually. The Union Army won the battle, and although there were heavy casualties on both sides, even though it was not really counted as a big battle, but the Union had to retreat when they learned that more Confederate troops were crossing the French border coming in. So they retreated, and they retreated through down what is now Boyds Creek Road, through Trumbull's Crossroads, and out towards Maryland. And we have to remember that in those days it was called Seville Pike. Seville Pike and what is now Old Seville Pike were the main road from Knoxville to Seville. There was no Chatham Highway, so everything big had to come through here. Meanwhile, the local soldiers had been imprisoned and died at overcrowded, unsanitary prisons. I'm sure you've all heard about Andersonville, where almost a third of the 45,000 people imprisoned there died, most of disease. There was also malnutrition, exposure to the elements. And Cahaba was another terrible prison where local people were kept. Cahaba was not quite as inhumane as Andersonville, but it was pretty bad. One person who survived Andersonville was D.W. Payne. He had a mill up what is now Mill Dam Road in Boyds Creek. He was a farmer, landowner. He was also a postmaster for a time, and he helped found the First Baptist Church, what became the First Baptist Church of Seymour. This is amazing to me. This man came home, was a pillar of the community, and there's no trace of PTSD, which I'm sure most of the combatants of this war has gone through. It's terrible. Anyway, on April the 9th, Robert E. Lee surrendered. The war was over, but the tragedies were not over. Lincoln was assassinated April the 15th. Shortly after that, a lot of the parole prisoners who were being sent out from prisons, taken to Vicksburg, and were going to be shipped up the Mississippi River, and then paroled and sent home, were boarded on the SS steamship Sultana. The Sultana, as you can see here, was terribly overcrowded. Someone was reading, they got paid so much per head. And there were only supposed to be 200 or 300 people on board that ship. There were actually 2,000. You can just see the men standing there. It was an old ship, not in good shape. Many of the men were the members of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, which was formed from men from Sevier, Blount, and Knox counties. So very, very local. The steamship's boiler exploded at 2 a.m. on April the 27th on the swollen Mississippi River just north of Memphis. And this was the biggest tragedy on maritime disaster in US history. It was worse than the Titanic. As many as 1,800 people died. It was, anyway, I have a list here, the next slide will show the names of the local men that I know from Boyds Creek who died. As you can see, many of them are well-known family names. Cresswells, the Cusicks have been here forever. Tipton, and Benjamin Chandler. He was not one of the Wheaton Chandlers, but he was nevertheless from here. And there were probably many more men. Those are the only names that we happened across, but it could be that you have got in your family some people that you know from Boyds Creek who died in that disaster. Some survived and they came home to normal lives. And one of those people was C.C. Tipton, who was the uncle of Andrew Tipton, who died. C.C. Tipton was thrown out by the explosion into the river like many other men. He managed to grab onto a horse, and the horse was pulling him to the back, he hoped, and he realized that his own weight was holding the horse back, and that the horse was not going to make it to the bank. So a dead horse came floating by, and he switched to the dead horse. And that dead horse did make it to the bank, and so did C.C. Tipton. So that just shows you that old saying about never changing horses in midstream. He said it was the best thing he ever did. Anyway, so actually he became a preacher. He was a pretty fiery Baptist, I think. And in later years, the Sultana Monument was erected at Mount Olive Baptist Church Cemetery on Maryville Pike in Knoxville. Has anybody here seen that? Yeah, oh, just one person, okay. It's well worth a visit, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. It's fairly easy to find, and it's this side of Knoxville. Anyway, at the end of the war, I'm afraid things got ugly because the Unionists were not nice winners. James Sharp, who was a Confederate, his cattle were stolen, his household goods were taken, and Elizabeth Grabson, who was the matriarch of the Grabson family, was forced to flee to Knoxville. Her house was stoned, livestock raided, outbuildings burned, and she wrote later, "It was with a sad, sad heart that I left the house that had sheltered me for over 50 years. And poor old lady, anyway. But here's one good thing. When John Chandler returned home, he gave Anne Wayland Chandler payment for keeping her part of the marriage contract bargain, $35,000, which in those days was a lot, even these days, a lot of money. She lived to a ripe old age, and she's buried at Trumbull's Crossroads Graveyard. And I'll leave it up to Colleen.
Thank you. Over 20,000 black soldiers from Tennessee joined the Union Army. That's the second highest enlistment of any state in the country, only beat by the Louisiana enlistments. Another 3,000 served in the county home guards. Theirs was the most personal war, as one enslaved man told his weeping mistress as she begged him not to leave. He said, "I'm not fighting against you, I'm fighting to be free." Morgan Carter, who's mentioned here, put it this way: "And now we have a choice to elevate ourselves and our race, and what little I can do toward it, I will do most willingly. If I should die before I receive the benefit of it, I will have the consolation of knowing that the generations to come will receive the blessing of it. And I think it the duty of all the men of our race to do what they can." After the war, most of the Chandler men, black men, returned to Wheatland's plantation, where they worked as paid farmers. Through land purchases and gifts from the Chandler family, they eventually amassed a large portion of the former plantation, which is now known as Chandler Gap, that lies down Cedar Springs Valley Road into the Knobs. Harrison Trundle and his brother-in-arms, Lawson Ransom, also returned as paid workers on the Trundle farm. Harrison was able to buy land from the Trundles in the Knobs. Both he and Lawson are buried in the Trundle family cemetery. Lawson must have died from the persistent diarrhea that had plagued him even after the war. That was true of black and white former soldiers. We recently discovered Harrison's small stone after a cleanup of the family cemetery. You see Steve pointing it out there. We were thrilled to find it. And Lawson's stone is the same military stone we see on all soldiers' graves in national cemeteries. In a traditional black neighborhood in Washington, D.C., stands the only monument to the Civil War service of black soldiers and sailors in the country. Along with the names of over 200,000 men are inscribed the names of Boyds Creek men who served and died for their country and their freedom. In Knoxville's national cemeteries lie 663 black women and men who perished in service during the Civil War. Tennessee State historian Bobby Lovett calls them, quote, "some of Tennessee's real heroes who defied evil Confederate principles, racism, treason, and rebellion against the United States." And that is the end. Before we take a few questions, I want to announce the first program in the How We Live series in 2024. It will be February 20th, 2024 here, and co-author of the book From the Mouth of Boyds Creek, Steve Petty, and Union Valley historian Kent Atkins will be talking about Tales from the French Broad. And that's not a woman at the local bar. So, are there any questions?
Great program. Great program.
Thank you, thank you. Well, you're a great audience. Thank you very much for coming, and we thank those who have been streaming this, and hope we see all of you at future programs. Thank you for coming.
By the way, is that your copy? Okay, my copy's just got a little sticker on the front, inside the front cover of the name. It's a round.